Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Reforged podcast. My name is Drew and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. In today's episode, we're going to be continuing our series on Lee Strobel's book, Case for Christ. We're going to be looking at chapter 6, where he considers some of the rebuttal evidence against the Gospels, particularly the widely publicized yet nowhere near mainstream New Testament views of the Jesus seminar. He's going to interview a scholar named Dr. Gregory Boyd, who is going to analyze some of the claims that the Jesus seminar or other cynical scholars of the New Testament have brought up and rebut them. So I hope you guys will enjoy that part of the episode. Before we get started, I'd just like to remind you that if you have any prayer requests that you'd like me praying over, please feel free to include those in the comment section of the YouTube or the Spotify show. I'd be happy to be praying for you. In my personal life, I have some very close family friends who have been going through a lot over the past couple months. Some of them have had their own health related concerns and been in and out of doctors for several months and are still looking for answers and treatment. Um, in addition, they have some relatives of theirs that are going through hospitalizations and hospice care and a lot of difficult things. So it's just been a very hard season for them. So I'd really just appreciate prayers for the Lord's presence and provision in their lives so that He would draw near to them in this time. Also appraised some other people that I've been praying for that are close to me have gotten some good medical answers and have received some treatment plans and care that should be effective. So prayers that the Lord would continue providing through that. But um, in addition to the prayers for my family and my family friends for health, just a praise that the Lord has been providing for a lot of those people as well. So thank you for your prayers. Let's get right into the episode's content. So, as I mentioned before, Lee Strobel was looking at the idea of a rebuttal. And so, what is a rebuttal? A rebuttal is evidence that can either explain, counteract, or disprove an original argument with its own counter argument. So, there's kind of two ways to look at the way that he sets up this chapter. One could be that the content that he's considering is going to be a rebuttal of its own against all of the other gospel and New Testament scholars that he's looked at thus far in the previous chapters, or you could look at it as if the scholar that he interviews in this chapter is rebuting this alternative viewpoint he's going to cover. And so the alternative viewpoint is from a group called the Jesus Seminar, which is a group of self proclaimed biblical scholars that have very contrary views to the commonly accepted view of the Gospels in the New Testament. They're a small, self selected group, and they generate a large amount of media coverage, despite the fact that academically they don't have a lot of influence as a group. The consensus is pretty much against them. However, the media likes sensationalism. It likes things that stir up attention and generate interest, and so their ideas have sort of infiltrated the culture in a lot of ways. The thing that they're most well known for doing is going through the entire Bible, or at least, sorry, the entire New Testament of the Bible, and considering and evaluating by their own criteria whether they think it's likely that Jesus actually said the quotes that are attributed to him. And they used a bead system to vote on and decide this. And so a red bead meant that Jesus most likely definitely said what is attributed to him. A pink bead means that Jesus probably said this. Um, it's fairly likely he did. A gray bead means that Jesus did not likely say this, but it may align or agree with something that he has said. And black is that Jesus did not say this or agree with this at all. And overwhelmingly, out of their voting system, they concluded that Jesus did not say over 82% of what is attributed to him in the Gospels. Um, the remaining 20% ish, it's sort of an odd metric with statistics because these numbers don't quite add up to 100, but um, of that remaining percentage, there was an 18% uncertainty, so sort of those gray and pink beads, and then a 2% certainty, so very small amount of actual red letters. And this stirred up a lot of controversy. They published their work in a book called The Five Gospels, which includes the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that we've covered previously that are familiar to most Christians. as well as the Gospel of Thomas, which has also been covered in Case for Christ in previous chapters, although it's usually not accepted as a reliable source because it is not part of the biblical canon. And there are reasons for that that have already been covered and will be covered later in the chapter. And they published it printed with their color coding for each of the lines of text. So the words are in the colors of those beads we mentioned. So after looking at the claims of this seminar and how the media latched onto it, a question Strobel has is, can what the seminar says, which is sort of counter to everything else he's heard so far, can that be rebutted? And so he interviews Gregory Boyd, a PhD, a doctor. Sorry, I said that really weird. Gregory Boyd, with a doctorate. He is a very well-known New Testament scholar, very influential. He was Ivy League educated, and he has written several books and articles actually opposing the teachings of the Jesus Seminar. Some of those books include Cynic Sage or Son of God, Jesus Under Siege, God at War, The Jesus Legend, and he also did work on the Quest Study Bible. Some of these books he wrote, and some of them he co-authored or contributed to. He also has a Bachelor's of Philosophy from Minnesota University. He has a Master of Divinity from Yale, and he has his doctorate from Princeton Theological Seminary. He is at least at the time of writing Case for Christ, he was an adjunct professor at Bethel University and a pastor at Woodland Hills Church. And so he's very quick to point out at the very start of the interview that the seminar is not the mainstream New Testament scholar view, despite what many articles imply that it is. So Boyd actually talks about a personal experience where he had a friend who was skeptic and asking some questions of him about Christianity. And that friend ended up dismissing his conversations with Boyd after reading into some of the New Age prevalent ideas that were published by the Jesus Seminar. And he thought that since these scholars were saying something that was more in line with his own beliefs and contrary to what Boyd was saying, that he could dismiss Boyd. So he's had experience with how these ideas have been very harmful to his own relationships and people that he knows. And the Jesus Seminar plays into this. They portray themselves as an authority figure. The criteria on which the Jesus Seminar evaluates the Gospels with is under something they created called the 7 Pillars of Scholarly Wisdom. However, most New Testament scholars have serious reservations about the implications of one or even multiple of these pillars, and they do represent a radical fringe or narrow-minded sort of thinking. Oftentimes, the Jesus Seminar finds themselves evaluating evidence for their conclusion based off of these pillars, which actually themselves contain preconceived notions or predetermined conclusions about what they're going to find. It's sort of a fundamentalist view of its own. They are very counter the fundamentalist view of the Bible. However, they ironically, as Boyd points out, have their own sort of fundamentalism because of the way that they judge the scripture. And the Jesus Seminar is upfront about what their goals are. As Boyd defines them, their goal is to rescue the Bible from fundamentalism and free Americans from believing that biblical Jesus is the real historical Jesus. And they want to create a new Jesus that fits in the modern times and fits into modern issues and situations. They're not actually taking their ideas that they have and testing them against the ideas of, well, generations and histories and traditions of previous scholars, but they're taking their ideas immediately to the mass culture and publicizing them. And ironically, or not ironically, I should say, incidentally, the Jesus they found is exactly the Jesus that they wanted this new Jesus to be. He is a diverse kind of person. He is a revolutionary, a fanatic, a magician, a feminist, an egalitarian. He is subversive. Jesus can be any number of these culturally relevant things to any number of people. And the thing that unifies all of the viewpoints that individual scholars may have about this new Jesus is that it's a naturalistic view of Christ. He is just an ordinary man. He's not Jesus Christ, Son of God. He's just Jesus. Natural man, just like anyone else, nothing supernatural about him. He was not God. He wasn't seen that way. He didn't even claim to be God, they believe. And anything about the Christian tradition is simply legend or a way of coping with the grief of losing a profound teacher. And so Strobel wants to, in interviewing Boyd, consider both the traditional, widely accepted scholarly view of the New Testament and of who Jesus is that he's been studying in these previous interviews against what the Jesus Seminar has claimed. And so the Jesus Seminar would argue that the individual faiths of New Testament scholars taints their scholarship and that they are an unbiased group. But is that really true? Boyd argues no. He admits that, of course, the individual faith of any Christian will affect the way that their scholarship is viewed, and no one can be truly unbiased in their viewing of Scripture. However, it is incorrect to say that the Jesus Seminar is unbiased. They have their own assumptions just like anyone would. In fact, they have a major assumption that's sort of baked into all of the work they're doing. They don't find the Gospels to be a reliable source. They are very critical and skeptical of the Gospel accounts. That's the entire reason why they wrote their five Gospels book and decided what Jesus did and didn't likely say. They believe, because of their naturalist view, that miracles are historically unlikely. They've never seen them with their own eyes. It is rare when they are recorded. They don't seem to believe that they even could exist at all. And so anything that is miraculous about Jesus, the signs and wonders he performed in his own death and resurrection, they don't believe as things that actually happened. Um, and they argue that naturalism is a normal view, so it's actually more absurd to believe in the supernatural claims in the Bible. Um, And Boyd kind of navigates this very well when questioned by Strobel. He says that there's a difference between appealing to what is supernatural and believing in the possibility of supernatural intervention. By definition, that which is supernatural is naturally an unlikely occurrence. It's not something that comes from the natural order. If it was, it would be natural, not supernatural. And there are many things that happen. In fact, almost everything that does happen in this world is natural. If a tree falls over, it could be that it had termites or that it's died and it's taken maybe a lightning strike or some other kind of force that has pushed it over. It doesn't necessarily mean that an angel came and pushed over the tree. However, to say that there's no supernatural intervention in this world is sort of a leap. Um, Ruling out the supernatural before analyzing Jesus and what the Gospels say about him obviously leads to the expected conclusion that any supernatural thing that Jesus does is not truthful, not realistic, it's made up. And so it's denied. If you're not believing in the thing that the gospel says Jesus does before you consider, hey, is the gospel reliably relating this thing? If you're already saying this can't happen, so if the gospel says this happened, that means that the gospel made it up. Sort of that's self defeating. Um, so instead, what Boyd argues is that we should grant the natural explanation for most things. However, we should not grant that God, who was the creator of our universe and the natural order of our universe, cannot supernaturally influence and enter into it. And I think, as Boyd does, as he says, it is humble to admit that there is a possibility. There's just a legitimate possibility that Christ is resurrected, to submit to the possibility of what the Gospels is claiming and then evaluate it on that basis. And he goes further in critiquing the assumptions and criteria that the Jesus Seminar uses. For instance, they assume that the church has made up most of the quotations and references of Christ. So there's already roots in that suspicion of the Gospels and that suspicion of the supernatural, as we just mentioned. And so while historians typically have the burden of proof on themselves to evaluate if a source is legitimate or not, instead the Jesus Seminar flips that and they put the burden on the sources themselves. They put the burden on the Gospels to prove themselves to be perfect. Um, it's quite dangerous to have those kinds of negative conclusions that can come from evaluating the Gospels the way that the Jesus Seminar does, which Boyd then gets into some specifics. One instance is double dissimilarity, which is the idea that if a quote seems that it either came from Jewish cultures and from the teaching of a rabbi, if it the way it's taught and what it teaches aligns with that, or if it seems aligned with the teaching of the church, then it must be something that was taken from one of those two places and attributed to Jesus, but not something Jesus actually said. However, this is observably kind of ridiculous because Jesus was Jewish, and he also was the founder of the Christian church. So obviously, there are going to be influences from both of these groups in what Jesus says. Another idea is multiple attestation. So the idea that only if multiple sources attribute something to Jesus can there be an assurance that Jesus actually said it. And it is a general true observation that multiplicity can affirm the validity of something. If you see something in multiple places, it's more likely that's true. However, we should not use that to disprove something that doesn't show up multiple places. That's a bridge too far. And in the case of the Jesus Seminar, a lot of times, like even having multiple gospel accounts of something doesn't count because they consider Matthew, Mark, and Luke because they're covering similar topics and there's some overlap in the content between them. They're considered as one source. And so obviously, when you have loaded criteria like that, it's similar to having a weighted die. It's going to inevitably bring the results that you desired and sought. Boyd is then interviewed on a couple of different parallels in mythological and in historical culture to Christ to see if, well, is it possible that Jesus and his character has been influenced by these other things? Has anything been stolen or taken or adapted? The first is Jesus just another wonder worker? This is an attempt to remove the unique divinity of Christ and say that he's just another Jewish miracle worker. And there are accounts of Jewish people of Jewish faith performing exorcism, praying for rains in a period of drought and receiving rain. So like they have worked miracles before. That's not unique. But however, the difference is Jesus' life, as Boyd will point out, is completely centered around miracles and the supernatural, and also his claims of divinity, which is unlike anyone else that's been recorded in Jewish history. Also, the nature of his miracles are significantly greater than just calling in rains. He performed his own exorcisms. He performed healings of many different diseases and conditions. He controlled the weather. He calmed storms. He multiplied fishes and loaves. He performed resurrections of others and of himself. And he performed these miracles of God's will, but he didn't do it by asking God to do them for him. He did it by his own authority. He is quoted saying, "If I, by the finger of God, cast out demons, then the kingdom of God is among you." He's also quoted to say, "I have been anointed to set the captives free." He's taking identity with this and he's taking authority with this. And he always gives God the glory for what is done, but he doesn't ask God's permission to do the miracles that he does in the New Testament because Jesus' will is already aligned with the will of God and he's already been authorized to do what he does by the divinity of who he is. So any parallel to miraculous rabbi sort of falls short and pale in comparison to the claims that Jesus is making in the Gospels. Now, there's also a figure known as Apollonius. He was a historical figure that was believed to have lived in the first century and to be a healer, an exorcist, possibly a resurrectionist himself, um, and to have appeared after his own death to those who followed him. Now it's widely Now he's widely claimed to be a legend. Um, So would that mean that Jesus too, since he is similar in a lot of ways to Apollonius, is he also just a legend? And there's a couple reasons why that's not a fair assessment. For one, the biographer Philostratus, who wrote about Apollonius, wrote over a century after the time of Apollonius, while the Gospels were written within the generation of Jesus. So there is less time for error and legend and mistakes to develop, of course, with the Gospels than there was for this. There's also four Gospels plus writings of Paul, plus external references like that of Josephus to Jesus, while there's only this one biography for Apollonius. Also, this biography was commissioned to be written by an empress who was building a temple to Apollonius, so there was obviously incentive and ulterior motive in writing it. And the Gospels, in the contrast, were written with nothing to gain and a lot to lose for those who wrote it and shared the word. There's also a much different writing style. It's more tentative than concrete. This Philostratus, he writes a lot of things that start with like "it is reported" or "some say." It's sort of more like storytelling, while obviously the Gospels are written concretely as if this is what really happened because historically this is what really happened. Um, and in a lot of ways, what Apollonius is alleged to have done is competing with the Christian tradition that's already been established of Jesus. Apollonius comes after Jesus. So it's unlikely that Apollonius could influence the tradition of Jesus because it was written so far after Jesus. It's more so the other way around. Um, and either way you slice it, all right, either Apollonius did some amazing things or he didn't. But if he did, that means that Jesus should also be taken seriously because if Apollonius can be taken seriously for the things he did and Jesus did those same things but more so, you need to take Jesus seriously. Or maybe he didn't, but since Jesus is much greater, both in the amount of evidence, the quality of it, and what his claims are, than Apollonius, he should also still be taken seriously. So it's sort of an irrelevant issue, is what Boyd argues. Uh, Also brought up is the idea of mystery religions. So a lot of the traditions, like that of a death and resurrection for God, and the traditions of baptism and communion rituals. Um, some people have argued in the past that those are sourced from lost, mysterious religions of the past. This is an unpopular, discredited idea in the mainstream. In fact, more likely, Christianity was actually borrowed from these supposed mysterious religions uh, than it borrowing from them. Jews viewed these ideas of what would be a mystery religion as pagan ideas. So anything that would be around them, they would guard against those things. And the through line that you see through any claim like there's some mystery religion that Jesus tradition is borrowing from here. The through line through that is that those religions, their tradition is always steeped in the idea of death and rebirth and mirroring the natural life cycle. And so they look at how crops will be planted, grow, be harvested, die, be regrown again. Um, They also have a legendary element to them. It's always once upon a time there was this God that did this thing. While Jesus is a very grounded historical account, the Gospels refer to specific people at specific times. Pilate, Caiaphas, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus of Cyrene, who carried Jesus' cross. Um, the death and rising in Jewish culture was not about this idea of rebirth. It was about the idea that God would bring a resurrection for his people after their death to reconcile them to him, and that would be a permanent thing. It's not a cycle or a rebirth. Um, the interesting thing is that all the parallels to these traditions of other mystery religions are post church. So the church and its tradition has already been established. So again, it's more likely that church is borrowed from than it is borrowing from others. And most of the stuff that these religions and even cults did were gruesome and violent and gross and not beautiful, not sacred. And so it's very unlikely that the church and what it professed would want to model after any of that. Also brought up, Strobel mentions, and this is something that the Jesus Seminar questions a lot too and brings up, is the idea of secret gospels. So um, there are some documents that they bring into question, like the Gospel of Thomas, which has been covered previous chapters. Idea of secret mark, or the cross gospel and Q. Now, none of these things, Strobel presents them to Boyd as the seminar does and say that they're new ideas and new discoveries. But Boyd points out that none of these are actually new. They've been around for a long time. A lot of them have been disproven. And also, they don't provide any new insights of Jesus. They can only be used to misshape and make a new Jesus that is contradictory to what we do know. For example, the Gospel of Thomas, been around a long time. It's been criticized and shown unreliable. I believe that the idea of Q has also been discussed in a previous chapter, but Q is the theory that Luke and Matthew, they have a lot of similarities in that they come from the same unknown source. Um, However, these liberal scholars under the Jesus Seminar are incorrectly turning Q instead from one source document that we don't have into layers of assembled legend. So that's a misrepresentation in and of itself. The idea that there's this secret mark out there, which is like an uncensored, full version of the Gospel of Mark. It says that Jesus is performing magic. It says that homosexuality is condoned and practiced by many of the early church. There's no proof of such a document found, though, however. The only reference that we had to it was there was some scholar who alleged that he found a quote from the works of Clement that referred to it. However, we don't have that quote even anymore. So either the scholar made it up or lost it, something happened, but that quote even doesn't exist. So um, the other thing Boyd brings up is that Clement unfortunately has a history of gullibility and permitted a lot of questionable, faulty documents. He was sort of naive about that. And so all that the secret mark idea is a non-existent work cited by a non-existent text by a writer taking place far after the actual original writing of the Gospels. And this writer himself is known for being naive. So pretty dismissible. Um, Also touching on the cross gospel, it's just a weird and outlandish sort of legendary type of work. It says when Jesus resurrects that he's giant and huge and is touching the clouds, and it says that a talking cross comes out of the tomb when he resurrects. And this very much contrasts the grounding and realism of the other gospels. And to touch back on the Gospel of Thomas for a minute too, it's clear that there's a lot of Gnostic influence, which was a religious movement in like the second and third century, um, that was focused around the idea of wisdom and knowledge, and having these secret insights that unlock the key to the universe. Again, this is well after the gospel was written, early first century. A line that I believe was mentioned too specifically. There's a line of Jesus quoted in the Gospel of Thomas that says, "Every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, this is very counter Jesus. It's very contradictory of everything that Jesus says and does in the actual Gospels. However, it aligns with a lot of the Gnostic views. So that influence is really clear. However, what the Jesus Seminar does is they argue, sort of arbitrarily, that this must be a reference to a tradition that predated the Gospels somehow. So even though this document was written far after, it refers to the Jesus far before the Gospels. I don't know how you can get much farther before the Gospels than like 20 years. Like when the Gospels, we talked a lot about how recently the works of Paul and the Gospels written, how close they were to when Jesus actually walked the earth. I don't know how you could fit some space in there, really. But that's their argument, and they argue that he was only they argue he was only a great teacher, and that no miracles were shown in these Gnostic works, and so that's the more accurate view because we see a lack of miracles. And their only reason for that credibility is because, again, it aligns with their preconceived naturalistic notion of who the original Jesus is. Which brings us in the idea of the Jesus of history versus the Jesus of faith. Now, the Jesus Seminar believes the Jesus of history, who they've created, is not the Jesus of faith. The Jesus of history, in their mind, is a bright, witty, countercultural guy who never claimed divinity. While then the Jesus of faith is a feel-good but wishful and unbased set of moral teachings. And so they believe that the Jesus of faith is really symbolic and it can be good for people, but it's not really historically truth based. Um, they believe that everything that is symbolized by Christ, his divinity, the cross, his sacrifice, his resurrection, they believe those things didn't actually happen. They believe that they're inspiring and can be beneficial, but they didn't actually happen. And they believe that the Jesus of faith is undiscoverable, sorry, because it doesn't align with the actual Jesus of history. However, as Boyd argues, Jesus himself can't be a meaningful symbol, so the Jesus of faith can't matter if the Jesus of history does not align with the Jesus of faith. The Nicene Creed is not something that is a wish, he says. It's something that is a reality. It's not say, we wish that these things were true, and they cite their creed. They say it with a faith and a confidence that it is truth. And theological truth is always based in historical truth. The Acts sermon about the empty tomb that Peter gives, he's saying, we have the tomb of David. We have the tomb of Christ, which is empty. You've seen this with your own eyes. They're taking the observable, natural, historical world, and they're using that as evidence to the claims that Jesus makes, which makes sense. And if we go back to the Jesus Seminar view that miracles don't exist, the natural view, that means that there can't be a resurrection, which means by even the Apostle Paul's own admission that there is no point in faith. It is meaningless. And as Boyd points out, no one wants to live by a meaningless symbol. Boyd wants to live by reality. So do I, and likely so do you. And Christianity has always been rooted in reality, as it's apparent from these works of genuine scholars. The liberal Jesus Seminar view of faith is not realistic, and that is sort of a pipe dream. But a legitimate, true, genuine faith is not. Instead, there's an important role that combining the Jesus of history and the Jesus of faith takes. Strobel asked Boyd, is the Jesus that he spends time researching and studying the same Jesus that he preaches at his church on a Sunday? And Boyd says, yes, it's a Jesus of history and faith precisely. He points out this way. If you love a person, that goes beyond the facts, but it's rooted in the facts. Let's take, for instance, a husband and a wife. A husband loves his wife because of what he knows to be true about her. She's beautiful, she's kind, she's sweet, she's nice. But the love goes beyond just those things. He knows those facts about her, but he could still choose not to love her. He could choose not to trust her. He makes a decision to love her and to trust her. And that decision is very deeply rooted in the evidence, the facts that he has, but it's not evidential alone. So he decides that he is going to choose to love her and to trust her because of all of the things that he knows to be true about her that makes her worthy of that love and trust. However, he still has to make that choice to love and trust. And thus is a relationship with Jesus. As Boyd describes his own relationship with Jesus, it's beyond knowing the facts. He has evidence for him, a lot of deep, compelling evidence for him, which enables him to make the choice, but he still has to make the choice to trust him and to walk with him daily. There are a lot of hard to believe claims of Jesus. Strobel, asks Boyd of that, like, aren't there some things that are just really difficult to believe about Jesus? And Boyd admits that yes, there are. But because of how strong the evidence is, that is an aid to his belief. There is a greater reason for him to believe in the Gospels than anything that the Jesus Seminar has produced. He would rather take the tested, proven, passing with flying colors, accurate gospel text than take the questionable, unreliable, faulty, and flawed sources that the Jesus Seminar leans on. And I'd like to read the ending of this chapter because this chapter is the last chapter of the first section of the book. And I'd like to just go over the things that Strobel says here, and I thought it'd be easier for me to express in his own words than in my own. So just to summarize real quick, we covered a lot of the thoughts and ideas of the Jesus Seminar and other contrary points to Jesus. And then we evaluated what this scholar, Dr. Gregory Boyd, had to say about them. And we find that, all that Strobel has been studying archaeologically, historically, literarily about the Gospels in the previous chapters, it really shows and aligns just um, still a faithful and very trustworthy source, while a lot of things that have been thrown as counter, um, if you evaluate those counterclaims, they are not nearly as strong as the Gospels themselves. But let's read that last part of the book. Back at my motel, I mentally played back my interview with Boyd. I felt the same way he did. If the Jesus of faith is not also the Jesus of history, he is powerless and meaningless. Unless he's rooted in reality, unless he's established his divinity by rising from the dead, he is just a feel good symbol who is as irrelevant as Santa Claus is. But there is good evidence that he's more than that. I had already heard well supporting eyewitness, documentary, corroborating, and scientific evidence supporting the New Testament claim that he is God incarnate, and I was getting ready to hit the road again to dig out even more historical material about his character and resurrection. Meanwhile, Greg Boyd is not a lone voice crying out against the Jesus Seminar. He's part of a growing crescendo of criticism coming not just from prominent conservative evangelicals, but also from other well respected scholars representing a wide variety of theological backgrounds. As was an example was as close as my motel's nightstand, where I reached over to pick up a book called The Real Jesus, which I had recently purchased. Its author is Dr. Luke Timothy Johnson, the highly regarded professor of New Testament and Christian origins at the Chandler School of Theology at Emory University. Johnson is a Roman Catholic who was a Benedictine monk before becoming a biblical scholar and writing a number of influential books. Johnson systematically skewers the Jesus Seminar, saying it by no means represents the cream of New Testament scholarship. It follows a process that is biased against the authenticity of the gospel traditions, and its results were already determined ahead of time. He concludes this is not responsible or even critical scholarship. It is a self indulgent charade. He goes on to quote other distinguished scholars with similar opinions, including Dr. Howard Clark Key, who called the seminar an academic disgrace, and Richard Hayes of Duke University, whose review of the five Gospels asserted that the case argued by this book would not stand up in any court. I closed the book and turned off the light. Tomorrow I'd resume my hunt for evidence that will stand up. So I think the way that he ends this section is very profound, and summarizes just how far he's come so far. And in watching these or reading this for yourself, the journey that he's taken you on as well, in considering the reliability of the Gospels. I'm really excited to continue this series and see what else Strobel has to say. So, thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed, please share it with your friends or family, anyone that you think would find it compelling. There's also a link in the description to purchase this book off of Amazon. I'd really encourage you to read it for yourself. Again, I sort of summarize the points and ideas. I find them interesting. I try to present what I read as clearly without my own intervention. Sometimes I'll throw in my own thoughts or opinions on things where I think it relevant, but generally, I'm sort of summarizing what is discussed in the book, oftentimes in less detail than the book does. So, if you find anything confusing, I would really, again, recommend looking at the book. The book goes into more detail itself, but also provides a lot of sources and supplementary information that you could look into to answer further questions. So, I'd really encourage you guys to do that. So, once again, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week. God bless you all. And remember, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another.